The wind whipped around my old pickup, rattling the windows as I drove deeper into the Montana Badlands, away from Helena's familiar comfort. I was chasing a story, a deep dive into a reclusive cult known only as the Fold. They operated out of an isolated valley, shrouded in secrecy and rumor, a charismatic leader pulling the strings of devout followers. As an investigative journalist, my instincts screamed there was something rotten at its core, something beyond their simple life facade. I'd spent months on the periphery, interviewing former members, piecing together fragments, but the real breakthrough always felt just out of reach. Then I found Luna. Or rather, she found me. I was parked by a dusty service road, a mile or so from the valley entrance, watching through binoculars when she stumbled out of the brush. She was a ghost, impossibly thin, hair tangled with twigs, eyes wide and haunted. Her clothes, a shapeless, drab tunic, screamed cult uniform. She looked like she'd walked through hell and back, barefoot and bleeding. My heart hammered against my ribs, a mix of journalistic excitement and sheer human concern. This was it, I thought, the key I'd been searching for. The escapee, the insider. I approached her cautiously, speaking in a low, soothing voice, identifying myself. She flinched at first, like a cornered animal, but then her gaze met mine, raw and desperate. She whispered her name, Luna, and said she'd run, that she couldn't take it anymore. The control, the fear. My mind raced. This wasn't just a story, it was a rescue. I saw myself as her liberator, the one who could give her a voice, expose the darkness she'd fled. I offered her water, a blanket, and then the most important thing I could give, safety. I told her I could help, that she didn't have to be afraid anymore. My apartment in Helena, though modest, suddenly felt like a sanctuary, a beacon of normalcy she desperately needed. I knew taking her in was unconventional, blurring lines, but I felt an undeniable pull, a profound sense of justice urging me forward. She was a victim, pure and simple, and I was going to help her reclaim her life. It felt right, an absolute moral imperative. The hope that swelled in my chest was immense, both for her and for the truth I believed we would uncover together. The early days were a delicate dance. Luna was a creature of shadows, flinching at loud noises, recoiling from bright lights. I saw her vulnerability, her trauma, and it only solidified my resolve. I gave her space, new clothes, food, simple things she devoured with a quiet hunger that spoke volumes. She rarely met my gaze directly, her eyes often fixed on some distant, unseen horror. But gradually, tentatively, she began to talk. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, describing the austere existence within the fold, the leader's hypnotic sermons, the rigid rules, the isolation. She painted a picture of quiet oppression, of minds being subtly molded, spirits slowly broken. I listened, my recorder silently capturing every word, my pen flying across my notebook. Each detail she offered felt like another piece of the puzzle, another nail in the cult's coffin. I felt a surge of professional pride, but more than that, a deep satisfaction in seeing the flicker of life return to her eyes as she spoke. I shared parts of my own research with her, careful not to reveal sources, but giving her context, showing her that others also suspected the fold's true nature. She'd nod, her expression thoughtful, sometimes adding a corroborating detail or a new perspective that instantly clarified something I'd struggled with. It felt like teamwork, a shared mission. I watched her slowly start to engage with the outside world, fascinated by the television, the internet, things she claimed had been forbidden. She asked innocent questions about everyday life, questions that highlighted the sheer depth of her isolation, and I answered them patiently, feeling a paternalistic pride in guiding her through this new reality. I felt her trust growing, a fragile, precious thing I was determined to protect. This wasn't just about the story anymore. It was about Luna, about her healing, about me providing the stable ground she so desperately needed. I felt a profound sense of purpose, of being exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. My expose was taking shape, vivid and damning, thanks to her bravery, to her truth. As weeks turned into months, the initial rush of discovery began to settle into a more routine, albeit intense, collaboration. Luna had shed some of her initial shyness, her eyes no longer quite so haunted. She even started to laugh sometimes, a soft, melodic sound that filled my small apartment with a warmth I hadn't realized it was missing. She was still fragile, yes, but there was a growing resilience, a budding confidence. She'd help me organize my notes, sometimes offering to transcribe parts of old interviews, her delicate handwriting surprisingly neat. I found myself relying on her more and more, not just for information, but for her quiet presence, the way she made my solitary work feel less lonely. We spent evenings talking, not just about the cult, but about our lives, our dreams. I told her about my aspirations, my hopes for this expose, how it could truly make a difference. She listened intently, her gaze unwavering, making me feel seen, truly heard. I started sharing more, perhaps too much. I talked about specific sources, people who had been afraid to speak publicly but had trusted me with their stories. I showed her drafts of my chapters, pointing out where her testimony was crucial, how it tied everything together. There were moments, fleeting instances, when a small detail in her story would snag in my mind, a slight inconsistency in a timeline or a peculiar turn of phrase. I'd rationalize it away, chalking it up to trauma, to the fractured nature of memory. She had suffered, after all. Her confusion was understandable. My editor called regularly, eager for updates, pressing for a submission date. The pressure was mounting, but I felt confident. We were so close. The expose was practically writing itself, a powerful indictment fueled by Luna's courage and my unwavering belief in her. I saw the finish line, and it glowed with the promise of justice, of vindication for all those who had been silenced by the fold. Luna was my co-pilot, my muse, my living, breathing proof that the truth would prevail. But the nagging doubts, once dismissed, began to accumulate, like pebbles in a shoe. They were small at first, easily ignored. A comment Luna made about a local official, a detail she couldn't possibly have known given her supposed isolation, or a subtle shift in her mood, a fleeting coldness in her eyes when I pressed for more specific details about the cult leader. She'd deflect, charmingly, with a story about a traumatic memory or a sudden headache. I'd always accept it, my compassion overriding my journalist's skepticism. My gut, however, started to twist. It was a cold, unfamiliar knot, tightening with each passing day. My research notes, meticulously organized, seemed to be shifting slightly in their placement when I returned to them. Small things, unimportant things, or so I told myself. I started testing her subtly. I'd mention a fictitious detail, a made-up source, just to see her reaction. She'd nod, absorb it, never question. And then, a few days later, she might reference that very detail in a casual conversation, perfectly integrating it into her fabricated narrative. It was chilling. My confidence in her, once absolute, began to erode, replaced by a growing dread. I remembered her eyes that first day, so wide and innocent. Was that an act? Was I so blinded by my desire to be a hero, to break this story, that I'd missed the obvious? The thought was a physical punch to the gut. I started rereading all my notes, cross-referencing everything she'd told me, pulling at every thread. The inconsistencies weren't small anymore. They were gaping holes, expertly patched with lies. The charming persona, the gentle voice, the innocent questions, it all began to curdle into something sinister. The expose, once my masterpiece, now felt tainted, a house of cards built on deception. The hope that had guided me for months was slowly transforming into a sickening suspicion, a cold realization that I might not be saving anyone at all. The confrontation was inevitable, a storm I'd been dreading but knew had to break. I remember the cold silence of my apartment that evening, the air thick with unspoken accusations. I laid out my evidence, not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating certainty. The inconsistencies, the fabricated details, the impossible knowledge she'd displayed. My voice was steady, but inside, I was shaking apart. She watched me, her expression unreadable, for a long moment. Then, slowly, the fragile mask she'd worn for months began to crack, revealing something I hadn't seen before, a chilling calm, a practiced resolve. She confessed, not with remorse, but with a detached professionalism that sent a shiver down my spine. She was not an escapee, she admitted, her voice no longer a whisper, but clear and precise. She was a plant, sent by the cult leader himself, specifically to infiltrate my life, to gather intelligence on my investigation, to discredit me. My journalistic zeal, my sense of justice, my desire to save her, it had all been meticulously used against me. She'd manipulated me, she explained, into revealing my sources, my research notes, every single detail of my expose. And she had been relaying it all back to the fold every night, enabling them to protect their secrets, to silence potential witnesses before I could even reach them. The ultimate betrayal wasn't just professional, it was personal. She had seen my vulnerability, my trust, and weaponized it. Then came the final, crushing blow. Tich E cult, she informed me, had now gathered enough leverage. They knew my sources. They had documented my unethical sheltering of a cult member. Her words, delivered with a smirk. They had a dossier ready to not only sabotage my career, but to threaten my loved ones. My family, my friends, they were all targets if I dared to proceed with my story. My blood ran cold. The silence that followed her words wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the deafening roar of my world imploding. Every shred of my self-worth, every moral conviction I held, shattered into a million pieces. The days following Luna's confession were a blur of panic and a cold, incapacitating despair. I was a puppet, dancing on strings held by a cult leader, and Luna had been the precise, elegant hand guiding the performance. The smear campaign began almost immediately, a whisper network spreading rumors through my professional circles, painting me as an unethical journalist, a predator even, who had taken advantage of a vulnerable young woman. My editor, though initially supportive, couldn't fight against the mounting pressure, the fabricated evidence of my misconduct. I was forced to abandon my expos, to bury months, years of work, watching my career crumble before my eyes. The humiliation was crushing, a heavy blanket that smothered any remaining sense of hope. I felt utterly broken, not just professionally, but personally. The idea of justice, of truth, felt like a cruel joke. I packed a bag, left my apartment, and effectively disappeared from Helena, cutting ties with everyone who could be remotely connected to me, haunted by Luna's final, chilling warning about my loved ones. I drove aimlessly for days, the Montana landscape blurring past, a reflection of my internal chaos. But beneath the despair, a tiny ember of defiance refused to die. I was down, but I wasn't out. I couldn't expose the cult directly, not now, not without risking everything. But I could still fight. I remembered an old contact, an FBI agent I'd interviewed years ago about rural militias, a man who worked in the shadows, dealing with domestic extremism. I found his number, took a deep breath, and made the call. My voice was tight, strained, but I laid out everything. The cult, my investigation, Luna's infiltration, the leverage they had on me. It was a confession of my own mistakes as much as it was a plea for justice. I handed over my entire archive, notes, recordings, my failed expos, a bitter pill to swallow, knowing it would never see print under my name. It was the only way forward, a silent declaration that their victory was temporary, that I would not simply disappear. The transition from ambitious journalist to small-town history teacher was not easy. For years, the ghost of my failure, of Luna's betrayal, haunted me. I took a job in a quiet town in central Montana, far from the echoes of my old life. The adrenaline of the newsroom was replaced by the predictable rhythm of school bells and the inquisitive chatter of teenagers. I taught history, but I wove in lessons about critical thinking, about media literacy, about questioning narratives and seeking out truth, all born from the ashes of my own brutal experience. I taught them about the seductive power of charismatic leaders, the dangers of blind faith, and the insidious ways manipulation could unfold, never explicitly referencing my past, but pouring my hard-won wisdom into every word. The FBI investigation moved glacially, quietly, a testament to the cult's deep roots and the caution required to dismantle such an organization. Years passed. My hair started to gray at the temples. The acute pain of betrayal softened into a dull ache, a scar I carried. I built a new life, a quieter one, finding solace in the dusty pages of history books and the bright, hopeful faces of my students. I learned to garden, to bake bread, to find joy in simple, tangible things. Then, one ordinary Tuesday, I saw a headline flash across a news ticker. Federal raids dismantle reclusive Montana cult. Leader arrested. My heart leaped. It was real. It had happened. Justice, albeit delayed and fought in the shadows, had finally arrived. I later received an anonymous email, a short, terse message from my old FBI contact. It simply said, "Your intel was crucial. Thank you." No mention of Luna, no mention of my disgrace, just a quiet acknowledgement of my contribution. It wasn't the heroic expose I'd envisioned, the grand unveiling of truth. It was a quiet, almost invisible victory. But it was a victory nonetheless. I learned that saving someone can sometimes lead to being consumed by their darkness, that idealism, unchecked, can be a dangerous blind spot. My own redemption wasn't in public glory, but in the quiet perseverance, in the subtle guidance I offered my students, in helping them navigate a world that often cloaked deceit in attractive packaging. The scar of Luna's betrayal remained, a permanent reminder of the price of trust, but it no longer defined me. I had found my own form of liberation, a profound peace in the knowledge that even from the shadows, I had made a difference. Life was still bittersweet, but it was profoundly mine, hard-won and true.